Hello, everybody. Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be continuing down the path that we started when we started looking at a very famous historical figure in psychology named Jean Piaget. Now, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is trying to find a way to transition from those early years of what we call developmental psychology to some of the more current approaches and philosophies that developmental psychologists take with them when doing research or trying to understand different components to this process that we call development. And to understand what it is that current developmental psychologists look at and how broad their scope is today, I thought we'd do a little activity. And this one tends to be a lot more fun when you have somebody sitting across from you and you're able to discuss this, but I still think we can have some fun with this and kind of enjoy the journey that many of us could potentially go on when we start thinking about this stuff. Because what I'd like for you to do in this activity is think back to when you were a fairly young child. Some of you might be able to remember vividly who you were at 5 or 6. Others might only be able to go back to, say, ages 9 or 10. But however far you can go back to when you had a clear recollection of who you are, I want you to do that. And I want you to compare the you then to the you now. And you can do this in a whole bunch of different ways. You could talk about your scholastic approaches, your cognitive skills. You could talk about some of your physical abilities that have shifted over your lifespan. You could also talk about maybe some of the social interaction aspects to your life, or how you bond with, say, family members or friends, maybe how your personality is different. What I want you to do, in essence, is just try to see if you can notice any shifts, any quantifiable or at least just notable differences that are there. And after you've thought of those, we can then move on to the next slide and talk about how all of this pertains to developmental psychology. Well, what I'm guessing you encountered there when you did this activity is this very quick realization that you are a fairly different person than you were when you were a kid. There probably are some similarities and there's some ebbs and flows that you could even chart out. And all of these ideas of change and flows and things that maybe triggered it is really at the heart of our current philosophy in developmental psychology. Developmental psychologists assume that all of us, from the moment we're conceived and become this first cell that we call a zygote, all the way into our last breath, are undergoing this change process. And this change can sometimes be growth, as most people assume when we look at the early ideas of developmental psychology, but it can also be decline or even shifts in certain aspects of who we are. And what developmental psychologists tend to do is just study this unfolding process. And to do it, they bring with them some assumptions, some ideas about how people work and how a lot of the things that we might want to study have universal components to them. And to understand these assumptions, a couple decades ago, I actually came up with an analogy. Maybe I used it from somebody else and I don't remember it coming from someone, but I like to call it my snowflake analogy. And for those of you wondering, this was long before the term snowflake had a political bias to it. Because of that, I think I get to keep it, even if maybe it has other things that have been tied to it since, because it does really aptly define what it is we're looking at in developmental psychology. So if you know anything about snowflakes, even being from California or some other place that doesn't get much snow, I'm guessing the one big fact that everybody's told about snowflakes, regardless of where they live, is that no two snowflakes are alike. This is obviously something that has never been verified by science. I cannot imagine a person running around taking pictures of millions of snowflakes trying to see if there's any identical ones. But it makes for a great story. That each snowflake is unique and the crystalline structures formed within them really come from a variety of things that are almost impossible to predict. But that's only part of the story. Right? If we look at things like humidity and temperature and altitude and wind velocity and all these other things, what we could potentially do, even if we can't understand every element to a snowflake, is understand components, general things that are going to probably be in a snowflake due to our knowledge of those other elements that are at play. This is kind of like human beings. Very few developmental psychologists would argue that you are like everybody around you, and we can tell you with certainty how everything in your life is going to unfold. But just like with snowflakes, it doesn't mean that we can't tell you anything. Developmental psychologists have essentially studied hundreds and thousands of individuals to try to map out how people change in semi-predictable patterns, especially if they encounter the right things. Well, not right, but the same things that shift them in different directions. What we get from this is, in essence, this kind of attempt to understand patterns of behavior, and also, while trying to understand these patterns, these changes that we undergo, the sources of them and the things that push us in different directions. That is not only at the heart of the original philosophy of developmental psychology, but it's really at the heart of all developmental psychology research out there, regardless of which aspect a developmental psychologist is studying. So if we want to look at what a developmental psychologist doing research might do, they can sort of fit into three different categories. The first and most common area of research for many early developmental psychologists was to just study the tracking or the patterns of development that most of us underwent as we progressed from infancy into adulthood. Nowadays, we've opened up that scope more. We've included more things that could potentially change and alter as we're progressing, but it's not necessarily the only thing that developmental psychologists study today. As I've mentioned earlier, another thing that we can look at is the things that cause a lot of the shifts that we're mapping out in the first approach that we just discussed. We, in earlier sections, when talking about Piaget and potentially other famous theorists, focused a lot of attention on kind of the general things that happened to us along the way. But we didn't necessarily focus a lot on certain moments in life that could have been the catalyst behind these shifts. Going to school for the first time, having your first relationship, separating yourself from certain people within maybe your family or your environment, having certain life events like new jobs, new academic endeavors change you, are some of the things that developmental psychologists have focused a lot on over the last few decades. And what these things have allowed us to do is not only kind of appreciate those changes that we see, but be able to understand some of the sources of the alterations that are there, and potentially study the last thing that some people have really focused on recently, and that's that kind of non-traditional things that can happen to individuals that shift some of these patterns that developmental psychologists have been talking about for decades. Sometimes in these non-traditional approaches, we look at individuals that through some type of biological or environmental thing are kind of on a different path from the very first day. Other researchers have focused on how specific life events or the lack of them could really shift the trajectory that people are on. What we can do when we use this in unison with some of the other research is get a much more holistic understanding of this unfolding process. And we can do this, as I've mentioned a couple times now, for a wide range of different things that go far beyond just looking at cognitive changes that happen in the early years of our life. Just to give you an example of how we might be able to do this, I thought I'd flash back to, well, the beginning for many of us, and that's the moment of birth. Now, I'm not asking you, if you're wondering, to try to remember back to the moment you're born. There's lots of research that would suggest that's probably not possible for you. But at some point, believe it or not, all of us were this newborn infant popping out and ready to be a person in the world around us. And what many developmental psychologists have gained the ability to do through numerous types of studies is get a really good sense as to what you probably had going for you at the moment of birth. And this is because nowadays we don't just study people at birth and beyond, we study people long before they've even come outside of the womb. As I mentioned earlier, we tend to study people from the moment they're conceived, from the moment they're this zygote, all the way until their death. So when you come out, we know lots of things about you. Some of them maybe not perfectly linked to psychology, right? We can know about things like how your muscles are developed and how your respiratory system works and whether or not your circulatory system is intact. And in fact, when you're born, most of you probably got a test looking at a lot of these things when they gave you something called the APGAR test, or sometimes it's called the APGAR scale. So yes, believe it or not, you were tested the moment you were born in all likelihood. And not only do these tests look at those things, but they look at a lot of the nervous system development that we've been discussing in earlier classes. We look for whether or not you have specific reflexes present in your body right at the moment you're born. We're looking at if you have the rudimentary sensory abilities of vision and hearing and potentially even taste and smell. And we're looking for whether or not some of those wirings that you're going to need to perfect with respect to your motor system are already starting to make their connections. And what this allows us to do is, even at birth, give us a sense as to whether or not everything seemed to have been progressing in the predictable way, and whether or not maybe there's something that needs to kind of be addressed if things aren't projected, or I guess progressed in the way that's anticipated, which could be just a matter of assessing what the cause is, or a matter of increasing some type of intervention to help people maybe get on track or speed up certain aspects of where they're struggling. And this happens not just from the moment of birth, as I mentioned, but throughout our lives. So as we progress in through childhood, we've got all of those wonderful cognitive changes that we undergo, some of the identity changes that were mentioned in the book and hopefully for some of you in lectures, and all these other things that you can read about in developmental psychology. So by the time we get into adolescence, we've gone through a lot. There's a lot of different things that have shifted us in different directions. So by the time we reach that wonderfully uncomfortable, odd stage in life called puberty, again, developmental psychologists can step in and say, there's all these different things going on that we can study and, well, understand a person more by looking at how things played out in their lives. For those of you that need a definition of puberty, and if you don't have it seared into your memory from some of those angsty years of adolescence, puberty is, by definition, this moment in our life where we start having specific areas of our brain secrete these chemicals called hormones, which are essentially neurotransmitters, but they're chemicals that are floating in our bloodstream. And these hormones work their way down our systems until they reach our gonads, or our sex organs, and those areas start producing large numbers of other hormones. And these hormones come in a variety of different forms, but the one that people tend to focus on are the hormones of estrogen and testosterone, which, when we undergo puberty, start to be secreted in massive amounts in comparison to what we were like just a few months or years ago. For women, usually puberty happens a little bit earlier than it does for men. Women being individuals who have the XX chromosome pair. For women in this grouping, what we tend to see is that they usually start some semblance of puberty at around age 9 or 10. For some, it might be delayed a little bit. And once it starts, it's kind of a gradual change, a gradual shift, where estrogen levels start to shoot up and testosterone levels start to shoot up in kind. And this produces a lot of the changes that we typically think of with puberty, both the physical ones relating to primary sex characteristics and the kind of more obscured ones when we talk about secondary sex characteristics and kind of some of the social mental changes that go along with an increase in these hormones circulating through our bodies. And this lasts for several years for most women, going until about the ages of 13 or 14, where puberty has sort of finally ended, even though the growth doesn't necessarily stop at this moment for many women. For men or people with the XY chromosome pair, what we see is that usually puberty takes a little bit longer to start, but when it starts, it usually comes on very strong in comparison to their opposite gendered peers. What we see there, or opposite sex peers, sorry. What we see there is that there's this 8-fold increase in the production of testosterone and a small uptick in estrogen or estradiol as males start to undergo puberty. And this produces a very rapid change in the primary and secondary sex characteristics of these men. And it tends to also result in some pretty dramatic social and mental shifts at the same exact time. And if we're looking at how puberty comes about, like we've done for everything else, we can talk about the sources of it, or we can talk about the things that it really shifts that goes beyond just the biological changes. In fact, many developmental psychologists today have focused on things like group dynamics and relationships and social interactions with peers and parents that come along with the early onset or late onset or whatever onset of puberty. We also can look at some of the cognitive changes that happen in terms of attention and emotionality and all of these other things that we tend to kind of intuitively understand as a part of puberty. But developmental psychologists only started studying it really scientifically for the last couple decades. What we can also do, as I mentioned before, is not only study the kind of typical changes that people undergo, but the less than common changes that are there, the atypical. And when we talk about puberty and the atypical, what we tend to focus on there is the early onset of puberty. Technically, there are individuals that experience delayed puberty, and this can be a problem for certain people, especially if that delayed puberty is paired up with other health issues. But most research looking at the impacts of kind of alterations to this path in puberty have focused a decent amount of attention on when people experience puberty much earlier than their peers. This particular effect is given a name when it happens not just a little bit sooner, but substantially sooner than peers. We call this precocious puberty. It's when people undergo puberty not only earlier than others, but it happens much more rapidly for these people. Technically, precocious puberty can happen for both male and female children, but it tends to be something that's a little bit more common, well, a lot more common actually, for females than males. Females have been diagnosed with precocious puberty about 10 times more often than males. And when we look at this, we're not only looking at things like the factors behind it, including things like stress, exposure to specific chemicals, some of the nutritional factors that have started to be linked to this, but we also look at the impact of this once it's started. Because not only do we see precocious puberty being something that could potentially be just a physical change problem in terms of health issues, but it's also something that has lots of other social implications. Numerous studies have shown that females tend to really, when they experience this, struggle with lots of social and kind of mental health issues. It's not a universal thing, so if you are somebody that underwent precocious puberty, remember individuals are unique, and it's never a guarantee when we talk about something happening that it has to happen to everybody. But statistically, what we tend to see is that girls who undergo puberty much earlier than their peers, we're talking usually about ages 8, maybe 7.5, but usually around 8, they tend to struggle a little bit more socially with their peers because, well, they kind of feel different from everybody, which tends to lead them to gravitate towards new, older peers. And they start to struggle a little bit more academically as well, feeling sort of not necessarily outcasted, but feeling like they don't necessarily fit in as much as they used to, and probably being treated very differently by not only their peers, but other individuals that are recognizing that they are physically changing at a much more rapid pace and much earlier than a lot of their peers. This not only for many girls impacts them at this young age, but numerous follow-up studies have shown that this can put girls on a trajectory that can be problematic. Numerous studies have shown that girls who undergo precocious puberty are much more likely to engage in early drug use, have issues with relationships, and potentially hang out with older peers that could result in problems when you're looking at childhood that persist for really the rest of their lives. That doesn't mean that this is something that's guaranteed again, but these statistics are pretty powerful, and they're things that developmental psychologists have focused on. And what makes this all the more intriguing and confusing to lots of developmental psychologists is that a lot of these effects that seem very robust for girls undergoing precocious puberty doesn't often occur for boys that undergo precocious puberty. Many of them don't experience the same academic issues, the same social issues, and any of the lingering effects that most researchers have focused on when it comes to girls. And why this is the case, how we can explain it, it's again part of the wonderful world of developmental psychology that allows people to really tease apart these effects. If you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to kind of go out there and look for it, because there is a lot of really cool things that developmental psychologists can do when looking at this very, I would say, tumultuous portion of our life. Just like there's lots of developmental psychologists that look at infancy, and lots that look at how life changes when you get into college impact us. That's the cool element to developmental psychology that's out there. Is we can focus in on lots of different ages and lots of things within those ages now that the field has grown so much since the work of Piaget and other early theorists. So just one more time to reiterate what kind of the classic approach to developmental psychology has been since the early conception of it. If somebody calls themselves a developmental psychologist, at least historically has called themselves a developmental psychologist, their main focus has been on change. They have either looked at the change process that's occurred, the things that are the sources of that change, or some of the more atypical things that could potentially shift these trajectories that we typically talk about for people. And by studying this change, we've gained a much greater understanding of our human experience on multiple levels at different points in our life. It's also important to note that there are other ways that developmental psychologists have tackled kind of who we are at different points. Another area of interest that has gained a lot of traction since it started to be studied and we have a much more scientific set of tools at our disposal is this concept of something that we alluded to earlier in the intelligence lectures called heritability. If you need a reminder, heritability is an attempt to understand where the source of certain features are. If something is high in heritability, it means that nature or kind of our biological predisposition is the key source to that characteristic. If something is low on heritability, it usually means nurture or some of the environmental social factors are kind of the key players in the development of a specific characteristic. Now, heritability research today is very advanced and complex, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. But just understand that in the early years of trying to understand heritability, before we could parse out genes and do all these really crazy things that we can do today, most heritability research focused on siblings and how we could study them in different ways to get a sense of how heritable some characteristic of interest actually was. So how do these classic sibling studies tell us about heritability? Well, there's lots of different ways that we can technically use sibling studies to understand heritability, but the vast majority of them in our history have essentially focused on mathematical models to get a better sense of where something's heritable and where it's not. What researchers tend to do when using siblings is find different types of sibling pairs that exist, so they can start to guess at how much of a specific characteristic is linked to, say, genetics, or what we sometimes call shared environments, siblings kind of encountering similar things in their families, and something else we call non-shared environments. Essentially just random encounters that people have along the way that shape certain elements to who they are. And to make these calculations, the classic group that is focused on a lot is this group called identical or monozygotic twins. Identical twins are twins that actually come from the exact same zygote. That's why we call it monozygotic, where when they're formed, they're actually the byproduct of the very first splitting of that zygote cell that becomes two separate individuals instead of just one person. Fraternal or dizygotic twins come from two separately fertilized eggs that are developing simultaneously within the womb. Their genetic overlap is actually identical to that of siblings more often than not, even though sometimes I guess there can be, if you've got multiple eggs or multiple types of sperm involved, actually less genetic overlap with fraternal twins versus siblings, but more often than not, siblings and fraternal twins have pretty much the same genetic overlap, with the expectation that fraternal twins have slightly more similar backgrounds and experiences in comparison to siblings. Well, these three types of classic siblings are ones that are often used in experiments, but researchers have also implemented research that's looked at how adopted siblings overlap with their peers to get even more of a sense of how important non-shared and shared environments might be in the emergence of some other things that hadn't really been explored as much until recently. It's important to note that there are other ways to look at siblings and to try to understand what makes them different from each other and similar to each other, and of how we can use that information to better understand this concept of heritability. If we're looking at our history of research on sibling pairs, some individuals haven't focused on just one aspect of things, but instead a multitude of things to better understand the heritability of different characteristics. One of our more controversial figures in developmental psychology was a researcher named Thomas Bouchard, who did this very famous Minnesota twin registry at the University of Minnesota for a considerable period of time, in which he would reach out to sibling pairs that had been separated at birth, usually born at the University of Minnesota's hospital, and not knowing that they were siblings with an identical twin, kind of track them down, asking them a whole slew of questions to see if he might be able to detect odd, more obscure overlaps between individuals in terms of their traits or other things that we typically link to either biology or the environment. And just so you can get a sampling of one of Bouchard's more famous studies and why he became this both instantaneous and controversial individual, I show you the story of two people who just so happen to be named Jim by their parents. We tend to call this the story of the Jims. In this Jim study, or like many of the other studies that he did, Bouchard found that there were two men that happened to be separated at birth, identical twins, no idea that they were actually identical twins, or raised by their adopted families not knowing that they had a sibling, that he would find through the records that they did have these individuals, and he would just go interview one of them first, asking them a large series of questions that didn't necessarily even have much rhyme or reason to it. He just kind of used whatever he could throw at them to figure out what they were like. So, for example, the first Jim that he talked to in this pair was a gentleman named Jim Lewis. I believe it was the one pictured on the left. And Jim Lewis was divorced from a woman named Linda, had remarried a woman named Betty, was middle class, was romantic and affectionate, or described as romantic and affectionate from his ex-wife, his new wife, not his ex-wife. Had a son named James Allen, a dog named Toy, worked at a wood shop, loved stock car racing, drank Miller Lite, was a chain smoker, and chewed his nails to the nub. These were just a sampling of some of the questions that he asked of Jim, but this was the type of stuff that he would do. He'd just find out all the subtle nuances, some of them seeing kind of obvious, some of them seem kind of random, and then go to the other sibling and see if there were any overlaps. And with the other Jim that he interviewed, oh, sorry, I forgot about the migraines thing. With the other Jim that he interviewed, named Jim Springer, again pictured on the right, he found out things like this Jim had divorced a woman named Linda and had remarried a woman named Betty, was described as middle class, romantic and affectionate, had a son named James Allen, a dog named Toy, worked at a wood shop, loved stock car racing, drank Miller Lite, was a chain smoker, and chewed his nails to the nub. Oh, and also struggled with migraines. These overlaps are obviously probably pretty jaw-dropping to any of you that didn't foresee this coming or didn't have the notes printed out. And we're not necessarily representative of every sibling pair that he found, but he inevitably was able to find numerous overlaps between almost every sibling pair that he looked at. And a lot of these overlaps were very difficult to explain as just random chance. And this brought on this celebration within the field about all the random things that might be more attributed to our genetics than we thought. And people started trying to find specific genes, and we'll talk about how we did this a little bit later, to explain where maybe naming somebody or going somewhere or preferring a specific beer might be sourced. But before we get too on board with Bouchard, as I mentioned, he's not only kind of one of our more popular individuals within the recent development of developmental psychology, but he's also one of the more controversial individuals. Because as you might have noticed, those questions were rather disjointed. And when he would report sibling pairs and their odd overlaps, we would not only find more usually disjointed overlaps, but they would be totally unique to that sibling pair. It's not like every sibling pair he looked at had the same beer preference or the same headache issues or the same whatever problems. And this led people to ask Bouchard simply how he came up with the questions he asked. I mean, what led him to just find these kind of random overlaps? And what he admitted in his work was that these were obviously not the only things he was asking of these people. He was asking the sibling pairs sometimes hundreds of questions in exploration to try to find what possibly overlapped between them. And when statisticians and really good researchers heard that, it raised a lot of alarms for them, because what they realized was that just through sheer statistics, a lot of the things that he found could have been just random chance. And unfortunately, because of the way our brains are programmed to constantly celebrate the random chance, we could have made way more out of this than we should have, statistically speaking. There's this analogy that I actually heard a number of years ago from a very kind of popular Radio Lab show, where they talked about how people could kind of close their eyes and imagine being a blade of grass in a giant field on a golf course. And on one sunny day, a golfer lines up to hit a ball, and you're not worried about it because you're hundreds and hundreds of yards away from this golfer, so no big deal, not going to be a problem. But on this day, the golfer just wallops the ball, and it goes screaming through the air, hitting random gusts of winds and little air pockets, and somehow through all of it ends up knocking you straight on your grass head. The analogy suggests that if you were that blade of grass, what would you think? And well, they ask, what would you think? And it suggests that you'd probably think something along the lines of, out of all the random things to happen, out of all the blades of grass that this ball could hit, how in the world did it hit me? How was I so probably unlucky to be hit by this golf ball? Right? But if you take a step back and look at it from the golfer's perspective, there's not much to celebrate there. Right? He cranked the ball. It was going to land somewhere, and it just so happened to land on this thing. It's sort of the way people look at the Bouchard research. If you're shooting in the dark, you're going to eventually hit something. It's just probably not what it was that you were aiming at. And if you want more about our kind of obsession with being able to figure out patterns and how we do make much ado out of nothing when it comes to randomness, I encourage you to actually go to the Radiolab link that I have here. I'm hoping it still works. I'm suddenly worried that I didn't check that before I posted this. But if you go there, hopefully you'll hear the episode that I'm referencing here. And it talks about these two girls who happen to both be named Laura Buxton and had this chance encounter because their birthdays were very similar and they both happen to be from the same region of England. And it goes off on all these really weird tangents, and it really hopefully gets you thinking about not only the randomness of the world, but how the randomness of the world is somewhat inevitable. It's just our brains are obsessed with trying to find those patterns and make a lot more out of them than we probably should. This brings us back to Bouchard's work. When people encountered these kind of realities to his data, lots of people pushed back and said, even if maybe this could give us an inkling that there are random things that are linked to genetics, we don't want to really jump on board with this. We would need consistency across a large number of individuals that were more than just statistical anomalies to be able to kind of support a lot of the findings that Bouchard had pushed. That a lot of people actually away from the work of Bouchard and to the work of other, more scientific-based people like a gentleman named Gerald McLaren, who was working at Penn State and also collaborating with a number of people over in Sweden. What they did in numerous studies was follow individuals not just through their childhood, but actually into the latter years of their life, looking for the development of specific diseases, either degenerative or kind of physical ailments that popped up, and a whole slew of other mental and cognitive skills to try to tease out, what were the sources of specific issues? What were the things that put people on one path versus another, focusing mostly on identical twins who seemingly would have similar genetics that should push them in things that we originally thought were very genetic linked in the same direction. Now, the work of McLaren also led to this large discussion about how, when we're talking about genes, we can't assume that genes are following this natural, automatically functioning trajectory. We started to talk about how genes can be turned on and turned off at specific points in our life or when we're exposed to certain things. And genes, when they interact with each other, can find ways to concoct very unusual outcomes when paired up with the situation in ways that it's really tough to kind of dissect and predict with much certainty. And this research of McLaren led to people really focusing their attention on something that had just started to become popular about 3 decades ago. This idea of something that we call genes. Now, to understand what I'm focusing on here, you do have to take a step sort of out of the psychology realm into biology. When you look at the cells within our bodies, neurons actually do have genes involved as well, but it's important to appreciate that pretty much every cell in our body has a nucleus, a structure inside of it that's kind of its central hub, and within that nucleus are these tiny strands that are wrapped together in this gigantic ball, and within those strands are these really interesting proteins that contain what we think is kind of the critical elements to who we and every other species are. For human beings, we have around 20,500 genes located along 23 pairs of different chromosomes. For most human beings, these bits of information found on these 23 chromosomes, these genes, are pretty darn similar. We have a ton of overlap. There's a few hundred, maybe even thousand things that can vary from person to person, and that's what tends to make us unique. But these genetic combinations that comprise who we are can actually nowadays be coded out. And we call your entire set of approximately 20,500 genes your genome. Now, a couple decades ago, being able to sequence a genome was thought of as this kind of ideal thing that we might never be able to get to. And eventually, we were not only able to sequence one genome in the span of a couple months, but we now can actually sequence pretty much everybody's genome in a span of a couple, maybe hours, minutes, if we're lucky. All we need is the right technology, the right devices, and boom, We can sequence pretty much anybody. And this affords us a lot of opportunities to look at this concept of heritability a lot more closely. Because we can talk now about very specific genes and gene combinations and how they potentially could be linked to things. But before we go overboard with this, understand that for a long time, people thought that sequencing the genome would break all the codes we needed to understand everything about human development and who we were and what caused us to become the person we've become. But now we realize through the work of McLaren and many other developmental psychologists that that's never going to be the final conclusion once we understand genes. There's going to be a lot that we need to appreciate about the environment, the interaction between genes, and when things happen, when certain genes are active and when certain genes are dormant, before we can really unravel a lot of the complexities to pretty much any human being. And being that there are so many complexities, and understand that we maybe will never understand everything about somebody and how they've become the, if we're going back to the snowflake analogy, the unique person they were. But at least we can get some sense of what somebody's like at a much better level through a lot of this work that's been done. So before we go, let's just recap where we went today. Obviously, we spent a lot of time just defining what developmental psychology was today. And we talked about some of the avenues that developmental psychologists can pursue when trying to understand this very broad area of what we call development. You might have noticed I didn't spend a lot of time talking about current things that people say at a major research institute are studying when it comes to developmental psychology, and that's because it's ridiculously multifaceted, and narrowing in on one specific individual will probably not do the field justice. It would narrow your understanding of what developmental psychologists do today. But if you are enticed by this, interested in exploring things, I encourage you to reach out to developmental psychology researchers and faculty all over the world, because some of the things that they're doing are very cutting edge, much like lots of the other things that we've talked about in biological psychology and cognitive psychology. And hopefully now that you've gotten through these lectures on developmental psych, you have a greater appreciation of all the different things that could potentially be explored with those individuals out there. That's going to mark the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see many of you soon. Take care.